Growing up in Portland, Maine, I idolized my big brother Tommy. He was funny, fearless, and easily the star of his high school football team. By senior year, his coaches were already talking scholarships, but Tommy had his own agenda. In 1964, he went to Vietnam to fly helicopters. He took a bullet over there, caught one mid-flight. In typical Tommy fashion, he still got that bird back to base and even landed it before passing out. The doctors fought to save him, but he died on the operating table. I was 13 when the news came. It broke us. For 5 long years, we were just a collection of people under one roof, not a family. By the time we were finally starting to heal, the draft hit. I was 18, unemployed, and an easy target for conscription. When my parents understood that, they unraveled. My mother all but lost her mind at the thought of losing a second son to the same war. My father wasn't much steadier. Unlike Tommy, I had no particular desire to see Vietnam. Tommy had wanted to fly, I just wanted to live. An old friend of my mother's had a brother in the church, and through him, I could get a scholarship for an undergraduate program at the University of Maine, with an expected path to seminary. Seminarians were draft exempt. The idea was simple: enroll, wait out the war, then quietly slip away once it was over. Only it didn't quite work out that way. Studying scripture gave me back a hope that Tommy's death had stripped from me. Faith turned out to be a powerful medicine. When the time came to walk away from the church, I stayed instead. To me, church meant service to God and to other people. I threw myself at every volunteer opportunity I could find and gravitated toward places that needed help the most. That's how I ended up with the Schoolhouse Project. In the late 70s, the Maine Council of Churches launched the program to bring Sunday school to kids in poor communities. They had chapters in Florida, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, and they wanted a 4th in Virginia. They asked me to spearhead it. I was honored and accepted on the spot. So in late spring of 1977, I drove south toward where Kentucky brushes up against the 2 Virginias, headed for a little Appalachian town I'll call Ashp, tucked deep in the hollers. For those unfamiliar, a holler is a small valley cut into those endless Appalachian hills, like arteries branching from a main road. Within 5 miles you might have 15 or 20 hollers, each hidden behind ridges and tree lines, each with its own scattered homes. Ashp sat on the main road that tied a bunch of those hollers together. By the time I arrived, coal was king. The mid-70s oil crisis had demand soaring, and Ashp was booming. Miners and their families poured in. The town's 2 churches managed to handle the adults, but nobody had the time or training to run Sunday school for the flood of children. That's where I came in. I rented a tiny room in a local boarding house, introduced myself to the town's preachers, and once I had their blessing, I scrounged up a big canvas tent, folding chairs, and a chalkboard. I expected it to take months to build a decent class. Instead, the very first Sunday my tent was packed. I taught them about Jonah and the whale. Kids always love that one, and about how God can pull us out even when everything feels lost. Parent feedback afterward was almost all positive. The lone complaint: not enough chairs. The following Sunday, nearly every family brought something from home: lawn chairs, old metal fold-ups, even a few milk crates. Anything that could hold a child's weight. The Virginia chapter of the Schoolhouse Project took off. Ashp was poor, but folks there were rich in spirit. Between teaching and visiting families, I quickly came to know most of the town. Some parents genuinely wanted their kids steeped in scripture. Others just needed someone to mind them for an hour while they slept off Saturday night. I came to suspect that Joshua's mother was firmly in that second group. Joshua was a quiet boy, about 7 or 8, with more shyness than confidence. His mom lived with him in a run-down trailer on the edge of town. On Sundays, she would drop him off without much more than a nod, barely speaking 2 words to me. So when Joshua missed Sunday school 2 weeks in a row, I worried. I called their trailer and was relieved when his mother told me he'd just been sick. But when Joshua finally showed up again, he looked awful, pale, exhausted, and even more timid than usual. One Sunday, I had the kids draw animals they thought might have been on Noah's Ark while they worked. I pulled Joshua aside and asked how he'd been. He stared at the ground. He said he'd been real sick and had to stay home and sleep a lot. When I asked what kind of sickness, he said he didn't know, just that it made him fall down and sleep a whole bunch until he felt better. It all sounded like something a child might say about a bad flu, so I didn't push. Then, just before I sent him back to his seat, he added that he'd had a strange dream while he was sick. He said that the first time he fell asleep, after he'd gotten so sick he couldn't stand, he dreamed he was walking through a forest of underpants trees. That phrase caught me so off guard that I laughed. Joshua grinned shyly when I repeated it back to him. Underpants trees, he nodded, and told me that while he walked through those trees, a bunch of make-do dolls stepped out from behind the trunks and started to play with him. Now, in case you've never heard of them, make-do dolls are an old Appalachian tradition, brought over by English and Scottish settlers in the 1800s. They're what you make when you don't have much, scraps of cloth stuffed and stitched into simple doll shapes with crude faces sewn on. Some folks got creative with hair and hats, but most are just lumpy sacks with smiles. So when Joshua talked about make-do dolls, I pictured a crowd of those sack dolls with crooked stitches and ragged features, grinning from ear to ear as they hopped out from behind those ridiculous underpants trees. Joshua said that if he had dreams like that every time he got sick, being sick wouldn't be so bad. The only downside, he added, was that after that dream he felt worse than ever and slept for a very long time before he started to feel better. I hate admitting this, but at the time I just chuckled. I told him it was one of the silliest dreams I'd ever heard and praised his imagination. He smiled again, started to walk away, then turned back and said something that made my stomach drop. "The next time I get so sick I fall down," he said, "I hope I don't have to sleep out in the woods again." I don't remember exactly how I finished that lesson after hearing that, only that I somehow did. For once, it was me who couldn't meet his mother's eyes when she came to pick him up. What Joshua told me sat heavy on my heart the rest of that day. The next morning, I used the boarding house phone to call the county sheriff. A few hours later, a young deputy, who I'll call Isaac, showed up to talk. I told him everything Joshua had said. Isaac frowned, then told me he'd check on the boy. He also reminded me that in Appalachia, being taken care of could mean something very different than what I was used to. People in that county worked themselves half to death just to keep food in the pantry. Even the good parents couldn't keep eyes on their kids every hour of the day. If the sheriff's office started filing neglect charges every time a kid wandered into a holler, he said, half the county would be in court. He promised he'd visit Joshua's home and talk to his mother. Maybe give a warning, but he added people like that didn't change overnight, especially not while most of their grocery money went into bottles. I knew he was right. You can't help people who don't want help. Still, the thought of the law breathing down Joshua's mother's neck gave me some comfort. A few days later, Isaac called back. He said the situation wasn't as bad as I'd feared. Joshua had collapsed out in the woods, yes, but his mother had panicked and searched for him after dark until she found him. Then she'd taken him home and nursed him back to health. That was music to my ears. I didn't want to ruin that family. I just wanted Joshua safe. There were no more strange absences and no more odd dreams, at least none that I heard about. I assumed that was the end of the matter. About 6 uneventful weeks slipped by. My only real sadness was knowing that eventually I would have to go back to Maine. Call Ash boring if you like. I found its quiet simplicity a blessing. Very little happened there, so when something did, it spread through town like wildfire. One afternoon at the grocery store, I waved to Chad behind the counter. Before I could even ask how he was, he said, "Hey, Pastor, did you hear about that fire over in Godby Holler?" I hadn't, of course. Still being somewhat new, I'd never even heard of Godby Holler. Chad filled me in. Godby Holler, he said, held the remains of an old plague town. After the Civil War, a deadly outbreak swept through a small settlement there. Authorities boarded up homes with the sick still inside. Later, they tried to burn the whole place to stop the disease, but some of the old houses survived. The holler had long since grown wild. You'd have to be crazy to walk in there if you didn't want to get snake bit, he said. Even if it hadn't been so overgrown, Chad added, locals still avoided Godby Holler like the plague because people said it was haunted. That's where the fire had broken out. It burned all night until the fire crews got it under control around dawn. There were already rumors, Chad told me, that angry spirits of the plague victims had set the blaze to finally cleanse the place. He and I both chalked it up to a careless teenager cigarette. Most townsfolk treated it like a strange but isolated incident. They had no way of knowing it was the start of a chain of events that none of us could stop. About 6 weeks before I was due to head back to Maine, 3 of Ashb's residents disappeared overnight. One owned a small trucking company, so I'll call him the trucker. Another was a supervisor at a lumber mill, the logger. Both were well-respected men with clean records. The third was different. For reasons that'll be obvious soon, I'll just call him the brother. He was a chronic drunk living in a filthy trailer in the same park as Joshua and his mother. Unlike the other two, the brother was very well known to law enforcement. He stole, fought, harassed people, and was a perpetual nuisance. And in a neat twist of cruel irony, he was Deputy Isaac's brother. I felt immediate sympathy when I learned that. It's one thing to police strangers. It's another when your own flesh and blood is the one always dragging the family name through the mud. When the 3 men vanished together, nobody believed it was some innocent fishing trip. They barely knew each other socially, and none left a note. Given the brothers' history, most assumed something criminal was afoot. Some feared the brother had killed the trucker and the logger, hidden their bodies, and fled. Others thought maybe all 3 were involved in something illegal, a drug deal gone bad, for instance, that had forced them to run. Days turned to weeks. The men did not return. The town grew desperate. People organized search parties, stapled missing person posters to telephone poles, and combed the woods calling out the men's names. As the weeks ticked by, the posters curled and yellowed. Hope thinned. That's when the vigils started. People walked the streets at night with candles, praying silently for the men's safe return. I joined everyone, even though each hurt to be part of, especially when I saw Deputy Isaac among them, eyes hollow with grief. At the time, I thought his experience as a cop was robbing him of hope, that he'd seen too many bodies in too many grim places to believe in happy endings. I went up to him one night and asked if he wanted to talk. He declined. Not long after the final vigil, one of the churches put up a hope tree. It was just a tall piece of cardboard cut into the shape of a pine tree, with photos of the 3 missing men pinned to it. Around its base, people placed flowers and candles and left notes expressing faith that the men would come home. The preacher said their hope, like God's love, was evergreen. It was simple and beautiful. Then one night, someone slipped into that church and savagely destroyed the hope tree. For a place like Ashb, it was a shock. Folks might have their disagreements, but they respected one another, and they especially respected the sanctity of the churches. To see something so meaningful smashed in such a violent way left people outraged. The sheriff was pressured to find whoever was responsible. Potential witnesses were urged to come forward. Suspicion spread. It broke my heart watching that close, gentle community begin to turn on itself. Anyone who hadn't been on the best of terms with the missing men suddenly found accusing eyes on them. One town meeting devolved into a shouting match and had to be ended early. The reason people were so keyed up was simple. The vandal had left something behind. It was a full sackcloth hood, a mask with a big, crude smile stitched across the front. Everyone in Ashp figured it was easy. Find who owned the mask and you'd find your vandal. But the sheriff never did. As it turned out, the person who owned that mask wasn't the one who left it there. I wouldn't learn that until the night before I drove back to Maine. That evening, the boarding house owner knocked on my door and said there was a call for me. It was Isaac. He sounded nothing like himself, slurred, brittle, almost desperate. He asked if we could talk. I invited him to the boarding house, but he said this needed to be private. We agreed to meet after dark a few miles outside town, not far from the entrance to the burned stretch of Holler. Naively, I thought it was going to be another teary goodbye. Many people in Ashp had already said their farewells. I figured Isaac, tough as he tried to act, didn't want to cry in public. In a sense, I was right. There were tears. There was a goodbye. But first he had a story to tell me, one that still rattles around in my mind, all these years later. I parked at our agreed spot and waited. He emerged from the darkness alone, a bottle of liquor in his hand, stumbling enough that I knew he was drunk. The sight of him like that unnerved me. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to be a simple farewell. After some awkward small talk, I asked what he wanted to discuss. He took a long pull from the bottle, seeming to gather his courage. Then he asked if he could make a confession to me as a pastor. I told him that in the Presbyterian tradition, confession is given straight to God. God sees and knows all, and he appreciates honesty from his children. I didn't have the sacramental role a Catholic priest might. Isaac said a heart-to-heart with God wasn't going to cut it just then. He needed to talk to another man. I understood and told him I'd listen. Before he began, he made me promise something. He said the only reason he was talking to me at all was because I was leaving in the morning. He asked if I ever planned on coming back to Ashp someday. When I said, hopefully, he shook his head. He told me to get that idea out of my mind. What he was about to share, he said, could never be known by anyone who lived in or around Ashp. Once I knew, I had to stay away for good. If I couldn't promise that, he'd keep his mouth shut. He looked so tormented that I agreed. The least I could do, I thought, was let him unburden himself. Once I swore to silence, he began. A few days before the fire in Holler, he'd run into an old coworker while in the neighboring county. The man now worked for the Russell County Sheriff. They caught up for a bit, then the coworker told Isaac about a recent case. The week before, he'd arrested a teenage prostitute for solicitation. While she sat in the back of his squad car, she began talking about a recent assault. At first, the coworker assumed she was inventing a horror story to earn sympathy and a cigarette, maybe a break from her cell. But as she went on, it became clear she was dead serious. She said a John had picked her up, driven her out somewhere isolated, and parked his truck. He'd given her a beer. They talked terms for a bit while they drank, and that was the last thing she remembered. She woke up in the woods, bruised from head to toe and in terrible pain. She didn't know what she'd been drugged with, only that it must have been powerful. She had only a few scattered memories, being taken into a haunted house by a man in a mask. And then, as she was being dragged back out, seeing the leaves on the trees turning into underpants. Isaac's old coworker had asked him what drug might cause blackouts, memory gaps, and hallucinations. Isaac told him there were a few, one being roofies, or rohypnol. But even as he spoke, his mind drifted. Driving back toward Ashp, he couldn't shake the image of leaves turning into underwear. He'd heard that somewhere before and recently. Then it clicked. I had once mentioned Joshua's Underpants trees dream in passing, and that odd little detail had stuck with him. He considered how astronomically unlikely it was that two people with no apparent connection, Joshua and a teenage prostitute, would conjure the same bizarre image months apart. The girl had also mentioned a haunted house. The only haunted place Isaac knew of near Ashp was Godby Holler, with its charred plague town that no one visited. With that in mind, he decided to stop by Godby Holler on his way home. The place had been mostly untouched for a century. The road in was little more than a rutted track. Anything short of a tank would bog down in there. He parked, took his pistol and flashlight and walked in on foot. Thorns and briars shredded his legs as he pushed through, but he found the old plague town without trouble. Scorched foundations, half-rotted beams, the skeletons of long abandoned houses. What he didn't find were Underpants trees, so he kept walking, circling the holler in a wide loop. On his way back out, tucked into a shaded corner, he came upon a small clearing ringed by dogwood trees with strangely colored blooms. They weren't flowers, they were underwear. Dozens of pairs of panties, all shapes, sizes, and colors, hung from the branches like grotesque ornaments. Isaac said he put it together in an instant. If the teenage prostitute hadn't imagined the Underpants trees or the masked, make-do dolls in that haunted place, then neither had Joshua. Those undergarments looked like trophies. If each pair represented a victim, the number was easily in the high double digits. How long had these men been operating here? Who were they? How had nobody noticed? He wrestled with those questions as he walked back to his truck and grabbed a spare can of gasoline from the bed. He knew burning those trees was wrong from an investigative standpoint. He was destroying potential evidence, but he didn't care. He wanted whoever was behind those sackcloth masks to know their secret sanctuary had been discovered. He doused the dogwoods in gasoline and set them ablaze. He watched until the fire took good hold, then drove back to Ashp. The next morning, the fire in Godby Holler was all anyone talked about. Playing the part of the clueless deputy, Isaac asked folks if they'd heard about it and watched their faces. Everyone reacted with surprised curiosity, everyone except his brother. When the brother heard about the fire, he suddenly had a bus to catch. That timing struck Isaac as more than coincidence. He drove to his brother's trailer to look around. In the back of an overcrowded closet, he found a bag. Inside was a sackcloth hood with a big stitched smile across the front. That night, the brother came home to a dark, quiet trailer. He had no idea that Isaac was waiting for him in that same closet, right beside the mask. Isaac told me what he did next without flinching. The law and the threat of a gun hadn't scared his brother enough to talk. Pain did. He shoved a wet rag into his brother's mouth to muffle the screams and beat him. Only after Isaac broke the first finger did the brother finally start to talk. He confessed that he, the trucker, and the logger had been selecting victims for nearly a decade. They didn't do it frequently, only when the brother was desperate enough for money that he'd agree to lure a child into the woods. He'd offer the kid a bottle of soda he'd spiked with heavy downers. Once the child was unconscious, the three men took them to Godby Holler. They'd gotten so used to dosing children that, when the brother tried the same trick on the teenage prostitute, he misjudged things badly. He gave her beer with the drugs or used the wrong amount, and for once his victim partially remembered what happened. That was his big mistake. And by sheer chance, the story of those Underpants leaves drifted back to Isaac. Having listened to his own brother describe his role as the linchpin in a local predator ring, Isaac had a choice to make. He eventually untied his brother, opened a couple of beers, and told him he could fix everything. All his brother had to do was call the trucker and the logger and set up a meeting so Isaac could smooth things over. The brother was so relieved he cried. Eager to save his own skin, He agreed immediately and called his partners. Once he relayed the time and place, Isaac grabbed him by the throat and strangled him there in his own trailer. Later that night, Isaac drove out to the meeting spot and waited. When the trucker and logger showed up, he killed them too. He loaded all three bodies, his brother S, the logger S, and the truckers, into his trunk, then drove to an old abandoned mine shaft a few counties over and dumped them deep inside. At first, he told me he was certain he had done the right thing. He said the legal system was like a sieve. Some crimes slipped through the holes. With a full confession in hand, he couldn't stand the thought that these men might never face true justice. He never regretted killing the logger or the trucker. It was the brother that haunted him. He couldn't shake the memory of the look in his brother's eyes when he realized that Isaac meant to kill him. It reminded him of the story of Cain and Abel, and he found himself asking the same question Cain did. Am I my brother's keeper? Had he failed in his duty by killing him? Should he have cuffed him instead, handed him over for trial, and in that way protected him from himself? That's when Isaac asked me, as plainly as a man can ask another, whether I believed someone who had killed his own brother could ever enter heaven. I told him that the oldest law still stands, thou shalt not kill. He would have to make a very strong case before the Lord. But I also said that if everything he had told me was true, if he had killed to stop men whose evil was so deep it might fairly be called satanic, then perhaps God might show mercy. Isaac explained that he'd shared this with me, and no one else, because the people of Ash could not bear that truth. The trucker and the logger had been pillars of the community. If their crimes came to light, it would shatter the town. A public trial would only drag things out and rip the community apart as every filthy detail emerged. So he chose to dispense justice personally and privately. What he didn't yet know was whether he could live with the memory of killing his own blood. I still think of Isaac and his brother. There are verses I wish I'd shared with him that night by God be holler. From Chronicles, if my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. And from Ezekiel, so I will tear down the wall which you plastered over with whitewash and bring it down to the ground, so that its foundation is laid bare, and when it falls, you will be consumed in its midst, and you will know that I am the Lord. That second verse is about the cost of concealing evil. When men tear down the walls hiding wickedness and let the guilty be consumed by their own sin, they become instruments of God's judgment. In this life or the next, there will be consequences for those who harm the innocent. I believe that strongly enough to stake my soul on it. So peace be upon you, Deputy Isaac. You know who you are. You're still in my prayers. I was born and raised in suburban Cincinnati. My childhood was mercifully dull, no great disasters, no dramatic tragedies. Both my parents were Cincinnati natives, as were 3 of my 4 grandparents. The odd one out was my mother's father, Grandpa Joe. He came from Jefferson, a small town out in Appalachian, North Carolina. I've never been there myself. I'm sure it has its charms, but Grandpa always talked about it with mixed feelings. Part of that was his work. He'd spent a little over 10 years as a deputy with the Ashe County Sheriff's Office. He used to say the job showed him the best and the worst of people, and that in Appalachia, the highs were very high, but the lows dipped lower than just about anywhere else. It's like there's something in the water out there, he'd tell me, puts a speck of darkness in even the kindest hearts. He had plenty of heartwarming stories, but he had frighteners too. This is one of the frighteners. Grandpa was a deputy through most of the 1980s. He was one of the officers on site when a plane full of cocaine had to make an emergency landing at the county airport because of bad weather. That incident made national news. Anytime a news anchor talked about the officers who seized the cocaine, Grandpa would mutter, "They're talking about me." But that's not this story. This one starts with a gentle old widower named Mr. Levi. Mr. Levi lived in a nice house just off Candlelight Drive. He'd run the old town barbershop until he sold it to the man who would own it for the next 40 years. After retiring, he'd cared for his wife until she passed away. In the years after her death, he filled his days visiting the Jeff Cafe for pie and coffee, and checking in at the barbershop to make sure the new owner was treating the place right. But he was best known around town for his tireless fundraising for the Ashe County Humane Society. According to Grandpa, Mr. Levi wasn't even particularly fond of animals. That had been his wife's passion. In her honor, though, he worked constantly to make sure the shelter's cats and dogs had everything they needed. He was well-liked, well-known, and a man of unshakable routine. Every morning he showed up at the cafe. Every afternoon he stopped by the barbershop. Sunday was the only exception. So when he failed to appear at the cafe one morning, the owner grew worried. She called the sheriff's office. Grandpa was sent to check on him. He drove over, knocked at the front door, and got no answer. Circling around back, he found the rear door wide open. Inside, he heard the sound of a children's cartoon playing on the television. That detail stuck with him. He said for a moment it eased his nerves, like nothing truly awful could happen while a kid's show was on. He called out Mr. Levi's name. No response. Then he stepped into the TV room. Mr. Levi was there, sitting upright in his favorite easy chair, the upholstery soaked in blood. His head was gone. Later, the medical examiner found that beheading might not have been the fatal wound. His feet and shins showed massive blunt force trauma, and there were 78 stab wounds in his chest, neck, and stomach. Grandpa called it a bloodbath, the worst crime scene he ever walked into. The first question everyone asked was, who would do something like that to Mr. Levi? The investigation went nowhere fast. No witnesses, no fingerprints. Nothing valuable appeared to be missing from the house. Whoever killed him had come and gone quietly, inflicting unimaginable violence in a short span of time. The sheriff and his deputies worked every angle, chased every lead. When the dust settled, they were no closer to finding the killer than they had been that first horrible day. As they grew more desperate, the sheriff asked Grandpa to look into Mr. Levi's family. Maybe a relative somewhere knew something. That's how Grandpa discovered that Mr. Levi was a distant descendant of a man named Emanuel Willis Wilson. I asked the same question you're probably asking now. Who? Emanuel Willis Wilson was the 7th governor of West Virginia. He's remembered for two things: his extended term due to an electoral dispute, and his refusal to extradite a man named William Hatfield to Kentucky to face charges. William "Devil Ants" Hatfield was the patriarch of the Hatfield family, the same Hatfields who fought the infamous feud with the McCoys from 1863 to 1891. Old Randall McCoy led the other side. The feud had its roots in the Civil War. Most families in that region sided with the Confederacy, but a McCoy named Asa Harmon McCoy fought for the Union. When he was bushwhacked after the war, Randall suspected the Hatfields. What followed was less a family squabble and more a private war. People in the area picked sides. That alone could put a target on your back. Night riders raided homes. Killings piled up. The feud got so bad that it drew national attention. When Kentucky tried to bring the Hatfields to justice, Governor Wilson blocked the extradition of Devil Ants. Some say that refusal may have spared Wilson's own life. Cooperating might have made him a target. Either way, by stepping in, he wrote himself into the Hatfield, McCoy story, whether he meant to or not. Devil Ants was so grateful he named one of his sons after Wilson. To this day, some folks see the governor as the man who could have ended the feud sooner and chose not to. All of that history led to a wild idea, that Mr. Levi's murder was somehow connected to the Hatfields and McCoys. even though the feud had officially ended almost a century earlier. When someone first joked about that theory at the sheriff's office, everybody laughed. It sounded absurd. But as real leads dried up, someone decided to take a look at the genealogical records of Jefferson residents, just in case. What he found was startling. On the McCoy side of the feud there, deep in a man named Bad Frank Phillips. Phillips died a few years after the feud ended, from complications after getting shot in the leg during a drunken argument. He left several daughters behind. Their mother couldn't support them, so she married them off to any men who could. Those daughters took their new husbands' names, had daughters of their own, and so on. Over generations, Phillips' bloodline diluted into dozens of family trees. Unless someone sits down and maps those trees. When Grandpa's fellow deputy did just that, he realized an unusual number of Bad Frank's descendants had settled in Ashe County, North Carolina, specifically in Jefferson. Out of roughly 1,500 residents, at least 11 could be traced back directly to Bad Frank, and those were just the ones he could confirm. If, and it was a big if, Mr. Levi's murder was some bizarre continuation of the Hatfield, McCoy feud. Then overnight they'd gone from 0 suspects to almost a dozen. The sheriff decided they might as well run it down. They checked alibis for all 11 descendants for the night of the murder. Only one had a rock-solid alibi. Several of the others were invited to the station for informal chats, nothing confrontational, just probing questions about where they'd been, what they'd heard, what they thought of Mr. Levi. By the time they'd spoken to 4 or 5 of them, the department was split. Half thought they were chasing shadows, seeing patterns where none existed. The other half, Grandpa included, thought almost any one of those people could have done it. Grandpa's theory went like this. Someone in town dug into their ancestry, discovered the connection to Bad Frank Phillips and the feud, then decided to research everyone else's lineage. When they realized Mr. Levi descended from Governor Wilson, the man who had protected Devil Anse Hatfield, they decided to continue the feud in the bloodiest way they could imagine. If that theory was right, the best way to find the killer would be to figure out who had been poring over those old genealogical records. But those records are open to the public at the county courthouse. At the time, no one kept track of who viewed them. There were no sign-in sheets, no cameras, just a lone deputy who kept order during court sessions. Grandpa told me all this, then fell quiet. I realized why. He was frustrated. The story had no ending. He left Jefferson with nothing but suspicions, and the sick feeling that someone in that small town believed they were still fighting a war started more than 100 years before. It was one of the reasons he was glad to put Appalachian law enforcement behind him. More than 30 years ago, back in 1995, I drove down to North Carolina for a camping weekend with some old friends. The place was called Standing Deer Campground, tucked into the foothills of the Great Smokies. It was one of the best weekends I'd had in ages. We hadn't seen each other in years, so those days of sitting around a fire with wine coolers, laughing and catching up, felt like we'd stepped back into our 20s. Monday morning, packing up was weirdly emotional. I could have stayed there for weeks. After I said my goodbyes and loaded up my car, I realized I didn't have enough gas to make it back to Indianapolis, where I was living at the time. I asked someone at the camp office where the nearest station was. They told me to take the southern road out of camp. There, DB1 near another campground called River Valley. They were right. A few miles down, I found a gas station perched on top of a small hill, the road curving around it. Trees covered the 2 sloping sides. I pulled up to a pump and saw it was one of those pay first places. I went inside, paid the clerk, then returned to my car and started filling the tank. I was watching the numbers climb when something moved at the tree line. At first, I saw nothing, just shadows. Then I saw it again. This time it was unmistakable. A man peeking out from behind a tree, staring at the station. He stood in deep shadow, so I couldn't see him clearly, but I swear our eyes locked for a second. Then he started walking up the slope toward me. He stepped into the sunlight and my stomach turned. He looked ruined. If I had to guess his age, I'd have said mid-30s. But if someone told me he was 50 or 20 with the hardest life imaginable, I'd have believed that too. He was rail thin, with sores dotting his bare arms. His tank top was so filthy, it was hard to imagine it had ever been white. As he got closer, I saw his eyes, bloodshot, sunk deep into bruised sockets, and his teeth, or what was left of them, blackened, brown, or missing entirely. Later I learned that was called meth mouth. He moved in a twitchy, jerky way, like his skin didn't quite fit, and something inside was trying to claw its way out. He was a walking nightmare. And he was walking straight for me. I glanced toward the station office. The clerk was behind the counter flipping through something, completely oblivious. While half my brain chanted, "Please, just take my car and go," the other half scrambled for a way to make enough noise to get the clerk's attention. Before I could do much of anything, the man reached behind his back and pulled out the most beat-up, filthy handgun I'd ever seen. There was nobody else around. I knew exactly who he was pointing it at. I threw my hands up, palms out. "Please don't shoot me," I shouted, loud enough that the clerk could hear if he was paying any attention. The man's eyes flicked toward the station just as the clerk looked up, took in the scene, and bolted for the back room. In that instant I thought, okay, he's either calling the cops or grabbing a gun. Both options were bad news for the man holding me at gunpoint, which meant I was now on borrowed time. He turned back to me, breathing hard. "Keys, wallet, now," he rasped. I tossed my keys on the ground between us and begged him again not to shoot. The keys landed a couple of feet away. When he bent to pick them up, he jerked back like he thought I might tackle him. He aimed the gun at me again, body tense, fingers twitching. "I'm not going to do anything," I said. "I don't have a gun. Just take the car and go." I was terrified, but I made myself stand still, every movement slow and deliberate. Finally, he lowered the gun slightly and turned toward my driver's side door. Relief washed over me. I took a few steps back so he wouldn't run over my feet. I didn't dare move more than that. I didn't want to startle him into shooting. He gripped the door handle, then stopped. He turned his head and stared at me. It felt like time froze. A second earlier, I was almost free. Now I was right back in it. I saw the realization go through his head. Even if he left with my car, I'd still be alive to give a description. He was about to have the cops on him with a license plate number and a face. His solution in that moment was simple. He'd kill me. He turned fully, raised the gun with both hands, and aimed straight at my head. I can still see his fingers starting to tense around the trigger. Then came the bang. I'd braced myself to be thrown backward, to feel fire tearing through my body, to hit the concrete and never get up. Instead, I watched his gun explode in his hand. It literally broke apart. Pieces flew. The remaining chunk dropped out of his grip along with strips of what had been his palm. For a heartbeat, there was total silence. Then he screamed. He collapsed backward, clutching his wrist as blood poured from what was left of his hand. Grandpa would later describe some crime scenes as meat, and that's what it looked like, raw, flayed meat. He kept screaming as he rolled on the ground. I was frozen, too stunned to move. A second later, the station clerk stepped out of the building with a long gun, rifle or shotgun, I'm not sure which. He leveled it at the man and shouted that if he moved another inch, he'd blow his head off. The man turned his rage on the clerk but didn't try to stand. The clerk shouted that the cops were on their way and told me firmly to get in my car and go. "Don't come back," he added. I stammered something about the police needing my statement. He said he'd seen the whole thing. Between his testimony and camera footage, if there was any, they had enough. He clearly knew I wasn't local, being so close to a popular campground. I think he also knew what sticking around would cost me. I listened. I got in my car and drove away, shaking so hard I had to pull over down the road to catch my breath. Only later did I realize how wise that clerk had been. If I'd stayed, I'd have been dragged into every part of the aftermath. Statements, court dates, maybe cross-examination from a defense attorney. Every time I'd have to relive what happened. By leaving, that moment stayed what it was. A single, horrible incident I survived and then drove away from. It was still one of the worst things that's ever happened to me, but it didn't become a whole chapter of my life. It stayed one nightmare scene that ended the moment the station disappeared in my rearview mirror. Hey friends, thanks for sticking with these stories. If you want to keep up with future narrations, make sure you hit that notification bell so you know when new ones drop. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9:00 p.m. Eastern, and there are live streams on Sunday and Wednesday nights if you like hanging out in real time. Got a story of your own? Send it over to horrorstory13a@gmail.com. You might hear it featured in an upcoming video. If you'd like to support the channel a little more, you can get early access to new narrations and bonus content over on Patreon. Or click the big join button here on the channel to see what perks are available for members. Don't forget the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear these stories in long compilations wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you're into true crime, I've also got a channel called Saturn Soul that you can check out. All the relevant links are down in the description. And finally, show of hands from however many unks out there are currently unulating.